Welcome everyone to the Success Looks Like Me Impact Career Panel. Planned for today is first a warm welcome to all of you joining us. I'm Dr. Jennifer Winward, the founder and CEO of Winward Academy, and it's my pleasure to be with you all today and to welcome our esteemed panelists. Today, we're going to hear from two professionals whose careers focus on both local and global impact. I'm going to post a link in the chat now, if you give me just 1 second. And what it is it's a link to a PDF that has more information and background about our panelists today. So if you want to read a little bit more about their bios, please feel free to do that. And then, of course, you can ask them any questions. Now, after chatting today with Ms. Patel and with Mr. Feinberg, we're going to welcome them both back at the end for Q&A for questions from you. Now, this career panel is proudly presented by the Carol Kimmelman Athletic and Academic Campus. For those of you who might not be familiar with the project, the Kimmelman Campus will be a world-class academic and athletic campus serving thousands of students and families from underserved communities, thanks to partnerships with the U.S. Tennis Association, Tiger Woods' charity, which is called the TGR Foundation, Disney, ESPN, the incredibly generous Karsh family, and Winward Academy. Now, on behalf of all of us supporting the Kimmelman campus, we want to thank our nonprofit and school partners for collaborating with us on this panel and for being with us today. So now what I'd like to do is introduce your esteemed panelists. I'm going to give you a little bit of information with their brief backgrounds. And then what I'll do is welcome Ms. Patel. We're going to do some questions with her. Then we'll get to talk to Mr. Feinberg. And then at the end, again, we're going to have them both together to do Q&A with you. So let me first share a little bit more about Ms. Patel. Until recently, she was the head of soccer operations at Angel City Football Club, which is a professional women's soccer team coming to Los Angeles next year. There, she oversaw all of the soccer operations, the external affairs for the club. A little bit about her education background. She got her bachelor's in political science from USC, from the University of Southern California. She got her JD from Loyola Law School. So she is a practicing attorney. And then she got her LLM in taxation from Northwestern University's Pritzker School of Law. So a little bit now about Mr. Feinberg. So he has spent the last 7 years working at the NBA to develop better diversity and inclusion for the organization. So he currently serves as the NBA's Associate Director of Social Responsibility. He got his bachelor's in political science from Northeastern University, where he also focused on global economics. So now that you know a little bit more, excuse me, about our panelists, I'd like to welcome Ms. Patel to please turn on her camera and microphone to join me. And then once she's with us, we'll go ahead and get started with questions. Good morning, Ms. Patel. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and jump right in, because this journey that you've been on recently to create a professional women's soccer team in LA, we are all excited to hear more about. So please, if you could just share a little bit more about that experience.
Sure. I was born and raised in LA for the most part, and I spent more recently, I spent a couple years in Denver with the Colorado Rapids MLS team. Had such an incredible experience there, but was really ready to come home. And so when I came back to LA, quickly got connected with the founder and president of Angel City, Julie Ehrman, and we just started talking about what the investors and the ownership's vision was, what they wanted to build, and the why behind it. And I thought it was really incredible, the way that they all kind of banded together. And it really came from understanding, the lack of kind of access and just even broadcast when it came to women's sports in general, but especially women's soccer. How do we have the most, we have the best athletes in the world when you look at our U.S. women's national team, but when can we see them play apart from these national team games? growing up in Southern California, and you have all these youth clubs, and there's not really a pathway for a lot of young women, because they don't see themselves on TV. They don't, it's easy to catch an MLS game, not so easy to catch an NWSL a game and watch women, right? And the idea is just we want to help grow the game and the sport, not just in LA, but domestically and internationally. And the only way you can do that is by growing the league as a whole, and really trying to get teams in bigger markets such as LA, and hopefully that's going to kind of start the ball rolling in other markets. So we have more teams coming in to the league, and more games broadcasted. So these young girls can kind of see themselves and say, hey, I can do that. Like, that's what I'm going towards. And, it was incredible. And I love that it's a community backed and community based mission. The sponsorship model is, we were the first to kind of implement it, where 10% of every sponsorship dollar is going directly back into the community. So we work with our sponsors to figure out where their passions are and what kind of initiatives they want to support and partner them with local organizations. So it'll go back into the community. But I think for us, it was really, let's do it different, and let's have it be a community-based and a community-centric organization.
That's great. And when you and I were chatting before the panel started, you mentioned that you were recently actually on a panel in Texas, kind of focusing on what are the efforts in that state to have a professional women's soccer team. Can you maybe share a little bit more about what you learned and shared on that panel?
Sure. I was on the panel with the founder of Gloria, as well as the Houston Dash head coach, and it was just a broader conversation of women's soccer in the U.S. in general, and also the growth and what we need in order to continue to make that happen. And obviously, being a Texas soccer panel, there was a discussion on kind of just the demand for another women's team in Texas, and a lot of guests work in terms of where could it be. Would it be Dallas? Would it be Austin? Would it be San Antonio? And things like that. And it's, I was just in Austin a couple weeks ago to look at the men's, to meet the men's team and check out their new stadium and practice facility. But there's definitely interest from that group as well, to bring a women's team there, and they have the facilities in the stadium, which is one of the biggest challenges for any women's team coming into the league. So, that's, in my mind, I think that's probably a good possibility, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and I would say that, going into a career in sports management is probably a huge dream, right, for a lot of young people, because they personally are athletes, they love sports, and then they just envision that being in a, professional setting with that would just be a dream come true for them. Can you share a little bit more about your journey into sports management and some of the things that you learned along the way?
Sure. I grew up in a really traditional South Asian family, where most of my family are doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, and things like that. And I think when I was really young, probably high school and undergrad solidified it for me. I knew eventually I wanted to work in the sports industry. I just didn't know how to get there. And I didn't have, sorry about that. I didn't have a built-in network, and I really didn't know anybody who was in it. And I would apply to, the millions of internship programs that existed. But I understood that I was just one of however many applicants. And so I never really could get my foot in the door. And I, after undergrad, I majored in poli sci, and I focused on law school because I love the versatility of the degree. You look at presidents of the United States that have law degrees. You look at, two general managers of NBA teams that have law degrees. And so I felt like that would, one, give me some like basic skill sets that I knew would be valuable across multiple industries. And then to also give myself a little bit of security. Like, parents were first generation immigrants. And my dad always tells me he landed at LAX with $8 in his pocket. And so the one thing that they always emphasized for me was, it doesn't matter what you do, whatever career, whatever profession you choose, whatever path you take. We just want you to get the best education you possibly can, but then you have to make the most of it while you're there, right? And so I appreciated that they kind of did everything they could to kind of help me get into the schools that I did and kind of get that educational background. That's helped me tremendously along the way. But I was lucky to have, these voices in my head that always just kind of reminded me that there's no linear path. There's no it doesn't have to be like in 3 years you have to hit this benchmark, in 5 years you have to be here, in 10 years this is where you need to be. And I think having that freedom of not feeling boxed into any kind of path from a timetable standpoint has let me kind of step out of my comfort zone in a lot of ways, and explore and take on opportunities that I otherwise would not have. But I do think for me, even now, there's a part of me that's like, well, if I can't make it in the sports industry, whatever that means, I can still always fall back on a law degree and go back to being a lawyer.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you share about how a law degree felt very secure for you because it is so versatile, right? Most people don't think about that. They think if I'm an attorney, I have to work in a law firm. So maybe can you share a little bit more about how what you learned in law school is actually used in sports management?
Sure. So I don't, I think law school really, you honed your analytical and comprehension skills too. But I think one of the biggest things that I learned was just the variety of people that I was working with in terms of my classmates, professors, and things like that. You really learn how to work with other people, very different backgrounds, personalities, and things like that. And I think that that's similar in terms of just being a lawyer and being a service provider, right? And being able to connect with your clients, because you have to, quote unquote, know your audience when you're writing, when you're speaking, understanding how they prefer to be communicated with, and things like that. And then when you translate that to sports management, you're dealing with ownership groups, you're dealing with players, you're dealing with agents, league office, all of these people that have different perspectives. And you're still trying to manage those relationships. And so I think there's a lot of similarities from that standpoint. And then even from just being at a law firm or you're a service provider where you're not working for one company, which is like your one client, you're servicing 25, 30 different clients at a time. And it's not always easy to figure out what to prioritize when. And you have sometimes conflicting interests. And same thing, that's how I felt dealing with players a lot of times, is I'm trying to kind of be a support system for a lot of players that are on my roster. But there's a lot going on. And so trying to find a diplomatic way of kind of dealing with all of that was incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it does seem like those skills that you're talking about are very transferable, right? So it's great that you were able to hone those in law school, but then apply them in so many different settings. So you mentioned earlier, right, that one huge part of the LA project was that 10% of revenue was going to go back to social impact projects, and that was something that was really critical to the mission of this new team. Can you share a little bit more about what those projects were and how you kind of were able to integrate a focus on impact with having this professional sports team?
Sure. I think one of the biggest things that we were able to do was announce like our jersey sponsor, and it being DoorDash. And DoorDash really wanted to address food insecurity in and around LA. And so, being able to kind of donate a certain number of dollars for each order that was being placed to certain like programs and organizations within LA that directly focus on that, which I think is incredible. I think we've also worked with LA84 Foundation, which is a nonprofit foundation which kind of grants funds to youth organizations around the city. And so we've had a ton of listening sessions with several organizations to try to figure out what do they really need and what are the biggest challenges, right? So one of the biggest challenges for especially girls to continue to play in sports is lack of access to a sports bra. And so trying to figure out a way of like, can we tie, you know, can we find one of our sponsors and build that into a potential sponsorship deal and say, is there a way to kind of tie our sponsorship relationship to donating a sports bra for, one sports bra or a certain number related to whatever we're doing. So then at least we're able to kind of help check that off the box. Another issue that was brought up was just in LA is sometimes safety. A lot of the youth organizations are practicing and having games in public parks in certain areas, and families don't often feel comfortable to, have their daughters or nieces in in neighborhoods in the spaces, and so a lot of times it's not, that's a reason why they drop out. And so trying to brainstorm, is there a way to partner with either LAPD or some kind of security organization to make it safer for everyone that's there, and kind of give parents peace of mind in terms of what we're doing.
Yeah. What I love that you're sharing too, that I'm hoping will kind of translate for the high schoolers, is that it sounds like what you did is, you had this vision, you decided that you wanted impact to be a part of it, and then you listen to people in the community, right? What are those pain points? What are people passionate about? What are the needs? What are the challenges? How do we address them? And I think that that process is something that maybe for some high schoolers feels like it's something only adults do, but that's really not the case, right? Because there are a lot of things that high schoolers can do with those same behaviors, right? Observing things in their environment, in their community, listening to people, asking questions, understanding needs, and then coming up with projects that can address those issues, right? So one thing maybe if you'd like to share, and then we'll go ahead and welcome Mr. Feinberg to join us, is what advice would you have for high schoolers right now who might be excited about the potential of a career in women's sports or in sports in general?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is, learn as much as you can. I don't even know how many years out of undergrad or high school now, but I still to this day am not shy about either reaching out to people on LinkedIn or that have career paths or in a position that I'm like, oh, this is incredible. Maybe that sounds interesting for me one day, or I would love to hear your story, and to reach out to folks that you are interested in connecting with, or maybe work somewhere where, you could see yourself or you want to learn more about. And I think you'd be surprised at how receptive and how responsive people actually are. The one thing I have heard, I think just internally within Angel City and then in sports, is we'll have a lot of front office executives that will have people reach out to them on LinkedIn and will respond. And then there's no follow up after that. So to kind of take that initiative and then keep it. And then when you're able to build those relationships, find a way to maintain them. Right. So if you have a great conversation with somebody once for like 15 minutes, make it a point like every quarter or whatever it is to check in with them, even to say hello, send them an article, or ask them about opportunities or things that you're interested in. But I would say just try to network now as much as you can, learn as much as you can, and then volunteer if there's opportunities to do that, because especially this industry, people tend to hire people that have experience, right? And it's even if it's volunteer experience, because they want to know you're passionate. They're passionate, you're passionate about it, and that I think you can pretty much do at any age.
Yeah, I think that that's fantastic advice, right? Whether you want to go into sports management or really any career, right? Just about building those relationships, nurturing them, keeping them. I mean, that's shocking to hear that someone would be so bold to reach out on LinkedIn and kind of take that first step and then not reply if the person responds. I mean, it's startling to hear that that happens. So I think it's really good for the people on the call to know, like, hey, if you do that outreach, make sure that you're really following up and building those relationships. That's so critical. Well, great. Well, thank you, Ms. Patel. If you don't mind kind of waiting a little bit, we're going to welcome Mr. Feinberg, kind of learn a little bit more about his position, and then we'll welcome you back at the end to do Q&A with everybody.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Feinberg, hopefully you can hear me. If you don't mind turning on your camera and unmuting yourself. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Jennifer, thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. We're all excited to learn more about the work that you do at the NBA. So maybe if you could just start by sharing a little bit more about kind of this niche of social responsibility and what you actually do at the NBA.
Yeah, I work in the Department of Social Responsibility and Player Programs at the NBA in the league office in New York City. And essentially, what that department does, just a few words, is manages what a player does off the court, whether it's player education, player marketing deals, youth basketball opportunities, and then specifically for my department, we work with players to sort of hone their community impact. Of course, we have a very robust community impact initiative and platform at the NBA that we like to refer to, or fans would refer to, as NBA Cares. And so we're working hand in hand with our players and our teams to sort of broaden that impact to create a larger story.
It's funny, I wish you were on the earlier panel because someone put a question about the Spurs and should they trade someone. Anyway, I didn't really know what what the person was asking, but it sounds like maybe that question should have been for you. But so it sounds like the NBA has this idea of like incentive-based basketball as a vehicle for social responsibility. So can you explain what that means, incentive-based basketball?
Yeah, and so I think it's just one of the ways that we create impactful programs in the community. But essentially, we understand that people love the NBA, and more specifically, love the game of basketball. Um, and so, what we do is we're not necessarily a foundation, right? We're not giving away a ton of money. What we're doing is we're using the game of basketball and the NBA brand to sort of uplift what community organizations are doing in the community. So, for example, and I'm just making this up, right? We work with a school or an after-school program. We provide basketballs and potentially tickets to a game to incentivize good behavior, right? So to incentivize their students or their clientele to work harder under their mission, right? And so that's what we call sort of in using the game of basketball as an incentive to, create more impact.
That's great. So then, speaking of impact, what effort have you seen at the NBA that you think produced the most impact?
Oh man,
That's
there's.
probably a tough question.
I mean, how much time we got? Um, listen, I can only speak for the programs that I'm closest to, because I think there are so many amazing programs, both at the league level, but also at the team level, and what players are doing in the community. You talk about, LeBron James sort of opening the I Promise school, like that is just impactful in its own, right? Um, and so I'm just going to stick to what I know because that's what we're good at, right? Um, so I work to manage our inclusion initiatives and activations that sort of is overarching in theme, but one of those pieces, right, is our sensory inclusion initiative, which aims to make the game more accessible to people with sensory needs. Now, when we talk about sensory needs, we're referring to people who have trouble with loud sounds, bright lights, really strong smells, a lot like places where there are a lot of people, right? And so that could be people with autism, people with PTSD, early onset dementia, and even in some cases, ADHD. Not to mention, by the way, any one of us can have sort of sensory issues, particularly as we're exiting quarantine, right? Where we haven't been with a bunch of people in large spaces. And so what we've done is we partnered with an organization called Culture City, which essentially makes small modifications to large venues and arenas to make them sensory inclusive, right? So if you or I had an issue with the sound of the game, right? Basketball games are loud. The PA is loud. People are cheering. We could go to 27 arenas throughout the NBA. Check out a sensory bag with noise canceling headphones, a weighted lap pad, a fidget toy, and be able to enjoy the game more than we would have, right? And so for me and you, maybe it wouldn't necessarily affect whether we stay at the game or whether we even attend the game at all. But for a lot of families, those factors matter, right? And so what we're doing is we're using the game of basketball, we're using the NBA to, create practices of inclusion, right? Like since we've integrated this into 27 arenas. Culture City as an organization has been able to sign on over 700 other venues and arenas throughout the world. Zoos, movie theaters, restaurants, bars, etc. Right. And so what we're doing is first and foremost, we're allowing fans to come to the game and enjoy it and be a part of the NBA. And separately and less consciously, we are sort of setting a standard for what we think large venues should create for their fans. So in terms of your question, like, again, there are a ton of impactful programs. I'm only going to speak to the programs that I work closely with. And that, I think, personally, is incredibly impactful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting because until you just shared that, I'd never even thought about what would a parent with a son or daughter with autism do if the child loved basketball, but if going to the actual game was overwhelming with the noise and the lights and the stimulation. And so I love that you shared that those are the types of projects happening at the NBA, because again, I would have never even known about those issues, that are faced by families and how you're working to make things more inclusive. So
yeah, well, and you bring up a good point, right? Like, what would these families do without it? And the answer is they just wouldn't go.
mm-hmm.
And so what's happening is we're seeing the intersection of doing good, right? Doing good for people and doing well, right? Our ability to sort of sell more tickets. And so what that shows is there is an intersection between social impact and the benefit to the business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then if it's okay, Mr. Feinberg, could you share a little bit more about kind of your educational journey, to end up working at the NBA?
Yeah, so I went to Northeastern University, as you mentioned, studied political science. I'll be honest with you, the goal was never to be in sports. I loved sports. I loved the NBA in particular, as coincidence would have it, but that was never even a thought in my mind. What I wanted to do is have an impact. And so I went to the nonprofit sector. I was an assistant grant writer for a while. I worked at a few nonprofits, and then I joined AmeriCorps, which is sort of the Peace Corps for domestic issues, right? So you sign up and you get placed in a certain place, and you can have an impact, right? And so I was placed in Austin, Texas, working for an organization there called College Forward, which, for all intents and purposes, created pathways for first generation high school students to make it to college, whether it was through college access services and the like. And so, really my journey was through impact. And so that's how I got to the MBA and have been blessed to be able to bring that to the private sector into my favorite league overall.
Yeah, and what I love that you shared too is that it sounds like even though you didn't always know you wanted to work for the NBA, you always knew that you cared about impact, and that along the way you were finding opportunities to just always play to that passion, and then it just evolved into this position, right? Where you still get to have an impact, but for such a big organization.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to people and they ask sort of how I got to the NBA, I think it was just sort of sticking to my values and sticking to what I wanted to do. And, just as helpful, by the way, is finding out what you don't want to do, because sometimes that's a bit easier to find out.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because sometimes, students are asking, what should I do over the summer? Should I do an internship? But what if I don't like it? Right. And the answer is always, that's good. That's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay if you don't like it. Right. The whole point is to put yourself out there, to try, to explore, and to just learn based on those experiences.
Right. Like, what didn't you like about that? Like, why didn't you, like identifying that is really helpful. I did that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So what I'd love to do now is welcome back Ms. Patel to join us. And we have lots of questions that have come into the Q&A. So let's see. We'll go ahead and start. Maybe Mr. Feinberg, you can answer the first one while she joins us. So the first question here is, where or when did you discover your niche in the professions that you have? So was there kind of a key moment when you really felt connected or knew that you were doing something you wanted to do, or was it something that more just kind of evolved over time?
I think it's I think it's really easy to see people's successes and think of their journey as a video montage in a movie where it seems super simple and straightforward, but it's really not. I think what's going to end up happening with a lot of people is that they're going to be working hard and they're going to be struggling and facing obstacles and getting around them and seeing successes year over year. And then one day they're just going to look back and say, oh, I guess that is sort of what success looks like. And I made it to where I wanted to go. And so there wasn't really a moment in time. I think every once in a while I take a step back and pinch myself at the fact that I'm working for the MBA in social impact. That is, something extraordinary in its own, but I couldn't say there was necessarily one point in time that I could sort of identify and say, yeah, I think, this is where I found myself.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Patel, anything you'd want to add to that question?
I mean, I think for like discovering your niche or what you want to do, to me has always been a journey. And I think I'm at a point where I don't know if I'll ever be like, oh no, this is exactly it. Because I always want to do more. Right. And I think that's part of life and kind of what you want to do. And I think that that's when I was talking earlier about having that flexibility or that freedom to kind of explore. It's, never been like, I don't want to be known for just one thing or kind of, hey, this is, the woman that does X. And so I think for me, it's part of my journey with every, opportunity I'm a part of.
Yeah. This next question is really good. It's kind of about, sometimes when students are in high school, they might think, oh, I want to be an attorney, or, oh, I want to, work in sports, but then they don't necessarily see the connection between the classes they're taking in school and kind of what those careers could be. So can you maybe share a little bit more about when you interact with high school students or with, college students, what are some of the skills that you're looking for that perhaps they're honing in these classes, even if that connection isn't super clear at the time? So maybe Ms. Patel, you can go ahead and start, and then we'll ask Mr. Feinberg.
Sure. I mean, I think with the high school students that I've worked with, I I don't know if it's the lawyer thing or just being curious when I was growing up, but I ask a million questions, and I think I always will. And I think that's done two things: one, show whoever I'm communicating with that I'm actually passionate and really interested in what you're asking me to do or what we're trying to accomplish, but then also showing that I just want to learn, and kind of add value whichever way I can. And so that's one thing that I would definitely say, especially when you're in high school and to your point, when you don't know what you want to do, and you're trying to figure it out. And to Daniel's point earlier, I know more of what I don't want to do than what I do want to do. Right. So I can see an opportunity and say, yeah, don't sign me up for that, because I know that's, kind of not what I'm passionate about or just not something I'm good at. So I think a lot of students that are really curious can ask a ton of questions, have kind of been really successful. I think the other thing is right now, it's been a weird year, in operating in this virtual and kind of remote environment where typically when I'm in an office setting or we're in the same place, it's so easy to walk up to somebody or knock on a door or pop your head in and say, hey, is there anything I can help you with? Is, what's on your plate today, just to learn as much as you can, not just about what you're working on, but maybe the bigger picture, of the organization. And not being able to do that, I think any of the students that I've been working with that kind of take more of initiative to do that, because it's not always easy saying, hey, can we hop on a Zoom or pick up the phone and call someone? And I understand it can be intimidating, but I think the ones that are kind of just, more, that take the initiative to do that, it kind of makes my life easier too. Because I'm like, oh, this is perfect. I just got off a call. I need to get these 18 things done. This person just called me. I can totally ask her to help me with, whatever it is. So I think initiative and then kind of being curious and showing how passionate you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Feinberg, anything to add to that kind of tips for high schoolers?
Well, hit it right on the nose. Obviously, curiosity, leadership, but I would just add one more, and that is, learning from your failures and coming back and sort of getting on the horse. I think I thought that successful people were sort of just good from the start, and that's really not the fact at all. They just messed up a lot and they learned from their mistakes. And that is so incredibly important to understand, because candidly, I mess up every day. And so, just understanding that and understanding sort of not to make the same mistakes twice is, I think, a huge indicator for success.
Yeah, I love that. I think that so much of what you're sharing about curiosity, about leadership, about demonstrating genuine interest, about being willing to learn from your mistakes, right? So much of this is obviously important in your career and your work and your focus on impact, but it's also just great for students who are applying to college, right? Trying to demonstrate that they have those characteristics, or when they're applying for a job, right? Demonstrating that that's a part of who they are will just, again, make them really attractive to people to work with, or to have them in their research lab, or to have them in a volunteer position. So yeah, I really appreciate that you both shared kind of those specific tips. So we have lots more questions here. Again, I'm so sorry to all of you if I can't get to all of your questions, but there is one here that I think is great. It's about, what if somebody is in a school or is in an organization and it doesn't necessarily have a focus on impact, or doesn't have a focus on social justice? What would you recommend to that person if that person wanted to change that, right? Wanted to make an organization more focused on those areas? Do you have any advice on that?
Is that for
Oh,
each?
sorry, it's for either of you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Feinberg.
Okay, well, I think the first step is understanding the organization's values, because that's where you're going to base all your decisions made. And if at the end of the day, the organization you work for doesn't have values that align with you, you would probably know that and identify that earlier rather than later, right? Because yeah, and so first and foremost, identify the values. Identify where there are places that you can have an impact, right? Because at the end of the day, take the NBA for instance, right? We understand who we are and we understand who we're not. And I think that's incredibly important when talking about impact. Like we're not going to host soccer camps, right? In cities, because that's not who we are. And so it's just understanding who you are, understanding your values, and starting from the bottom, and sort of identifying those and connecting those. And that's where you can begin, right? If you work for a small company that, a small tech company or something, I mean, whether it's providing tech services to, older adults, or, creating opportunities for Black and brown youth who are interested in STEM and STEAM and those types of opportunities. I mean, that's where you can sort of connect the dots and understand where you can have the best impact. But at the end of the day, understanding who you are, understanding the values of the organization you work for is, like, bottom line, the first thing you should do.
That's great. Ms. Patel, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. And I mean, I'll say this coming from experience. I think there are organizations that don't live up to the values that they project, right? And I've lived it, where I'm like, okay, I interviewed, and you go through, I don't know, a couple weeks of interviews, and they sell you on the environment being X, and this is what's important. And then you step in and they're not living that day to day. And so all of a sudden you realize, okay, on paper, this is what these are their values, but in reality, these are their values that they're operating under, right? And so sometimes even when you're clear on what you want to do and what's important to you, it may not align. To Daniel's point, it may not align with the place you're working in. But I think whenever I think of impact, I never think of, there's never been a need for me to have an actual department or a function or a group that's dedicated to that. It's a lifestyle, right? You think about, I'm female and brown and 5'2". In the sports industry, I know there's not a lot of people that look like me, right? But no matter where I've been, I think about being able to open doors and giving someone an opportunity that may not have been able to have one before. But every time I hire, that's part of how I live. I want to cast a widest net as possible, right? Happy to take referrals from everyone. And you have sometimes owners saying, oh, my son wants to do this or my daughter wants to do this. And then I'm like, no, but let's post it online, right? Because there are probably a bunch of unicorns that we don't even know about. But being able to kind of be thoughtful in everything that you're doing, even if that specific focus, there's not a function that's solely dedicated to that, I think is really important. And I think it's also a way of showing people what's important to you, right? And you might be able to change the organization that you're in. So maybe there wasn't a group focus on impact before, but seeing what you do and being able to kind of inspire the people around you to kind of follow in those footsteps or kind of make changes in areas where they do have control over, I think is really important too. And that's a way for you to have impact on the company as a whole, right? To start with and see what you can do from there.
Yeah, I love your idea of impact as a lifestyle, right? It's just something that if this is just something that you live and breathe and choose to focus on, it's just a part of who you are, right? It doesn't have to be a separate thing or a separate bucket. It's just integrated into all of the decisions that you make, into how you treat people, into how you hire, right? To your point, like, hey, if we want to hire someone, let's spread it out, right? Let's really see what the opportunities are that we can create for as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it looks like we maybe have time for one more question. Again, so many wonderful questions. Thank you all so much for submitting these. Maybe what we can do is end with each of you just sharing, if you were to give your high school self advice, right, based on what you've learned now, as successful adults, what would you have done differently, or what would you have kind of told yourself? And maybe Mr. Feinberg, you can start, and then Ms. Patel will end with you.
Yeah, when I was younger, I thought that I was going to plan out my life and it was going to go exactly according to plan. And I think there are opportunities that I missed out on, frankly, because I was so, focused on the details and adhering to that plan. And I would just say, be open to veering off the course, so to speak, because sometimes those are the best opportunities.
I guess I'll add to that for my high school self. Getting a B is not the end of the world, and it's not worth crying over. No one's gonna care. And I think what I would similarly not put so much pressure on myself to have to go to a certain school or be in a certain place, and not box myself in, and really just make a decision in terms of where I want to go and what I want to do based on what feels right. And I think that I've learned throughout the years that your intuition is really important too. And I think I wish I would have trusted that more than kind of what everyone else wanted me to do or expected me to do.
Yeah, it sounds like both of you had a similar message of just allowing yourself to be more open, right? Not trying to fit yourself in a specific box with specific expectations all the time, but just kind of wishing that maybe you'd been open to other opportunities. So I think that's good for young people to hear, especially now, right? As they feel very overwhelmed, they've been out of school for a long time, and hybrid models in, out, right? A lot of young people right now, quite frankly, feel like ping pong balls, right? In and out of school. It's been a really challenging time. So I think that idea of being open to opportunities, living and breathing impact, especially if it is something that's really important to you. I really want the people joining us today to recognize that even though they're in high school, doesn't mean that they can't have an impact, right? It doesn't mean that they can't find something that they're really passionate about, that they can connect to, and where they can listen to people in their community and identify that need, and then find ways to address those needs. Okay, well, I want to thank both of you so much again for joining us, Mr. Feinberg, Ms. Patel. It was wonderful to hear from both of you. We appreciate your time. For the students on the call, remember that our next panel starts in 30 minutes. It's our inclusion panel. Remember, you are supposed to reconnect with your teachers right now to do some reflection, and hopefully you really enjoyed what you've learned today. Any last words from either of you, Ms. Patel or Mr. Feinberg, before we say goodbye to our students?
I mean, Yeah, I'll say this now. I'm always looking to help anyone that's in this industry. If I can connect you with people, if you want to learn as much as you can, we'll definitely encourage you guys to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll respond to, as everyone I can at some point. But, I'm more than happy to kind of have more conversations with whoever's interested.
That's wonderful. And you expect them to return your message, yes?
I would hope so.
Yes, I hope so too. And Mr. Feinberg, any last words to share?
I think things are going to be all right. That's what I would share. Things are just going to be all right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think definitely, especially for people who are feeling overwhelmed about college and about experiences and extracurriculars and school, right? There's a lot on everyone's plate. And so I think that that message of just being open and forgiving yourself and taking good care of yourself and really connecting to your values and what's important to you, right? I think that both of you, what you really captured today is that in your successful careers, you stayed true to yourself and what really mattered to you and your passions and your commitment to impact. And I think that that's just such a critical thing for people to hear, that, they could end up in different places, but if they're always coming back to that core value, it's always going to be the best guide for them. So, all right. Well, thank you both again so much. Thank you again to all the students and teachers joining us today. And we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
again. Take care, everybody. We'll see the rest of you in 30.